Então vamos começar, ok. So we're gonna begin start this session, plenary session with a paper that will be presented by Dante, and I, Paulo Lustosa, will discuss this paper also. So I'll be mediating this session, and at the same time, I will discuss his paper. I think so, because I don't see anybody here from the organizing committee. So I think I'm the mediator of this session also. So Dante, you have 20 minutes for present your paper, then I will have 25 minutes, and then we open for the audience for 15 minutes. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, just let me see if you can see my screen, please. Okay, right. Hope you can see it. You can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much for being here, Professor Paulo Lustosa. Thank you all for coming to this session. My name is Dante. I am a PhD student at ISCTE, University Institute of Lisbon, here in Portugal. And I'm going to present to you all this paper on the effect of dominant firm shocks in earnings management. This paper was developed in collaboration with professors Isabel Lourenço, Professor Fábio Costa, and Manuel Castelo Branco, right? So actually, we have been presenting this paper in some conferences in Brazil, in here in Europe as well. And of course, we are getting some feedbacks. So if you have any suggestion, any tips, any mm, any comments, they for sure will be more than welcome. But yeah, okay, just let's go to talk about the paper, and I would like to begin really briefly talking a little bit about the motivation of this paper, right? So many of you know for sure some of those companies, right? Google, Apple, Facebook, and others, because they are basically in our daily life, right? We consume the product, the products of those companies and the service of those companies, and actually they operate usually in an international basis, and they are here because those companies are among the world's largest companies in 2020 according to the global finance ranking. And just for you have an idea about how astronomical are the numbers of those companies, I have here some data to show you. For example, Alphabet, the Google's parent company, generated in 2019 sales around $162 billion. That is basically the Ukraine's GDP in the same year in 2019. Apple in 2019 as well generated $260 billion of sales, that is close to Vietnam's GDP, and Amazon 280 billions dollars, that is basically Pakistan's GDP. So we are talking here about companies that each of them basically will generate sales close to what one whole country generate in terms of GDP. So they are astronomic large, and they can impact consequently their economies in many ways. Besides that, those companies during the pandemic seems to be growing even more than before. So we are seeing some companies facing some challenges, but those firms, though, those very large firms, uh, seems to be growing during crisis moments. So we have, besides that, some empirical evidence uh, of the economic literature saying that those large firms, in fact, impact not only their GDPs, the country's GDP where they are situated, but also they can influence other firms that are close to them, close to those large companies. So taking this background into account, our aim here in this paper is basically to investigate whether dominant firms' idiosyncratic shocks can affect earnings management of non-dominant firms. But I need to explain you what is a dominant firm shock, right? And how this could happen. How can those dominant firm shocks can affect earnings management of other firms? So, talking a little bit about our contextualization of the expectations that we have in this paper, the role of those companies, those extremely large companies that we are calling in our paper as dominant firms, and their effect on worldwide economies has been stunning. And we have many evidence in economic literature about this role. Okay, so this seminal paper from Gabe in 2011 provide empirical evidence that shocks of those large companies, of the 100 firms, 100 largest firms in the US, seems to explain a significant part of GDP growth. So basically, the idea here is that when those large companies growth, they can impact the GDP growth of their countries. This is the main idea here. And we also have some evidence from the economic literature suggesting that dominant firm shocks can affect market values, investment decisions, and also market volatility. But we know very little about how firm level shocks of those large companies can affect the earnings quality of other firms, specifically concerning the manipulation of accounting amounts. And here is the point that we are contributing to the previous literature. But I need to explain you what is a firm shock, right? And we are using here a definition very clear in economic literature, where a shock is basically the difference between the actual and the expected sales growth of firms. Okay, so in other words, when a company have high levels of firm shock, right? When a company have high levels of shock, basically means that this firm grows more than the country or even the industry average growth. It will depend on the benchmark that we are taking into account, right? So similarly, if we are talking about lower levels of firm shocks, we are basically talking about that those firms usually growth less than the country or the industry average growth where they are headquartered. This is the idea of firm shocks, okay? And this is the definition that we are using here in our paper. So our main expectation, as I mentioned it, is that dominant firm shocks can affect non-dominant firms, right? specifically concerning earnings management of non-dominant firms. And so we have two main arguments to sustain this expectation. The first one is that when dominant firms present high levels of shocks, right, those shocks can affect uh, the opportunity growth of other firms, of non-dominant firms. And we have several channels throughout that shocks can affect non-dominant firms. For example, dominant firms' knowledge externalities or even state income tax payments. So, for example, when dominant firms growth abnormally, they can probably pay more taxes to the state, right? And consequently, the state can use this money to invest in economic development, and probably non-dominant firms will be beneficiated from these investments. This is just one channel throughout these shocks can beneficiate non-dominant firms. So through this beneficiated process, non-dominant firms consequently could feel less motivated to engage in earnings management practice because this could positively affect their results. This is just one channel that we are arguing here in our paper. But high levels of dominant firm shocks can affect earnings management of non-dominant firms in a more indirect way through their effect on the overall macroeconomic aggregates. And here is the main findings that Garbe presented in 2011. So growing abnormally will consequently affect the macroeconomic aggregates of the country where those firms are situated, and consequently will generate lower levels of economic policy uncertainty, and then managers of non-dominant firms could feel again a lower pressure to present better results. And one more time, discouraging earnings management practice because managers could not feel or could even think that it's not necessary to manipulate earnings because the operations of their companies are already enough to the market. This is just an idea and an expectation that we are empirically testing in our paper, okay? So we are testing this based on this simple model, considering earnings management of non-dominant firms as our dependent variable, and dominant firm shocks as our main independent variable. We are also taking into account a bunch of control variables concerning earnings management, literature of non-dominant firms, of course, and taking year, industry, and country fixed effects. So we are classifying dominant firms and non-dominant firms following previous economic literature, where we are basically taking the whole sample and divided this sample in dominant firms and non-dominant firms, considering dominant firms as the top 100 sales rank firms for each country and year, right? And consequently, the rest of the firms will be non-dominant firms. Uh, Dominant firm shocks are basically the residuals of a simple model where we are taking sales growth as dependent variable on a bunch of year and industry or even country dummy variables. And this is the residual, the idiosyncratic components of sale growth of those large companies, right? And we are scaling these residuals by considering the sales growth of those companies divided by countries' GDP, based on economic literature uh, as well. So we have two measures of dominant firm shocks, one considering just year and country benchmarks, and the other considering year, industry, and country as benchmarks, okay? And then we basically sum all of those shocks of dominant firms and considering this sum as the aggregate dominant firm shocks for that country in that year. This is our main idea here of this measure. The earnings management of non-dominant firms, right? That is the setting that we are interested is basically measured by three different proxies of earnings management based on three different models, of course. And we are using the residuals of those models in a unsigned approach. So taking the absolute value of those residuals, considering them as discretionary accruals proxy for our earnings management of non-dominant firms. So we are estimating these models only for non-dominant firms in each year and each country in each industry. So our sample here is based on non-dominant listed firms from data stream universe, hard quoted in European Union countries. We, of course, excluded financial institutions and also drop observations that had negative shareholder equity. And we are analyzing these between 2000 and 2018. And so the final sample is based in these 1,300 firm year observations, around 1,300 observations from 9 European Union countries. This is a overall presentation of our sample, just of non-dominant firms, right? This is the main setting that we are analyzing. We have firms from France, Germany, UK, and other countries. Just for you have an idea about how different is the sales between dominant and non-dominant firms, we have differences on average around billions of dollars between dominant and non-dominant firms. So they are huge different in terms of what those companies generate concerning sales, okay, or revenues. So our descriptive statistics and variables on average are very similar to previous literature, all of them. In our main estimations shows that dominant shocks of non-dominant firms present a negative and significant coefficient for some of our earnings management variables, suggesting a negative association between dominant firm shocks and earnings management of non-dominant firms, aligned what we were expecting based on that theoretical discussion that I mentioned some minutes ago. Even taking into account our first measure of dominant firm shocks, or even taking into account our second measure based on year, industry, and country benchmarks. We also proceeded in some robustness analysis, considering other measures of earnings management, not only discretionary accruals, because discretionary accruals measures has been criticized by the literature, as many of you may know, and we considered here another earnings management measure taking into account small positive earnings, and actually we find very similar results suggesting a negative association between dominant firm shocks and earnings management. And finally, we also proceeded in a additional analysis considering here the moderating role, the potential moderating role of IFRS adoption in audit quality, but actually we didn't find any moderating role of those two important factors for earnings management, right? So basically, IFRS and earnings quality seems not to play any role in order to moderate this association between dominant firm shocks and earnings management of non-dominant firms. So, okay, taking all of these findings together, we basically find here in our paper empirical results suggesting that the level of dominant firm shocks of each country year is negatively associated to earnings management practice of non-dominant firms. And actually, this simply suggests that dominant firm shocks seems to discourage earnings management of non-dominant firms. And we believe on the relevance of those findings, given that large firms have not only have an impact on general economy where they are headquartered, but they also seems to affect strategical decisions of small business, specifically concerning the relation in relation to manipulation of accounting amounts that firms usually rely on. So um, we believe that these findings have several implications to the market that could be interested in the role of those companies, specifically in when they are analyzing the earnings quality of those firms, of those large and small firms as well. So thank you so much for your attention. And yeah, I'm fully available to answer any questions or receive any suggestions. Thank you so much. Hello. Oh, yeah. Professor. Oh, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dante, for your presentation. It's your good research, undoubtedly. And now I'm making some considerations about your paper, and I'll share my screen here first. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee of this conference for granting me this opportunity to discuss this paper and to learn something about your research. And I also send my greetings to the authors, Dante, Isabel, Fabio, and Manuel, for this interesting research. First of all, I want to see your problem in a graphical way. So I did my big picture, what I think about your paper. So we have a group of dominant firms that they face a shock in sales, as you define it. And you measure this shock by abnormal sales. And this shock will spill over in non-dominant firms. And this shock will spill over in both directions. So when there's a positive abnormal sales here, we have a decrease in non-dominant firms' earnings management. And also when there's a decrease in sales, in in dominant firms, we expect an increase in earnings management in non-dominant firms group. So this is a graphical way of representing your research question. And your empirical model is to see the relation between earnings management and these dominant shocks after controlling for a bunch of variables. And also you lag the dominant shocks. You see the dominant shocks in the previous years or in the beginning of the year, and earnings managed along all 1 year period ahead. And for measuring earnings management, you measure earnings management in 4 different ways. Use first modified Jones model in 1995, then second modified Jones, 2005, third modified Jones in 2012, and then you standardized the previous measures, and you get the mean of the discretionary accruals of the previous model. And you calculate everything in modules using an unsighted way, as you said. And for measuring the independent variable, you weighted average of dominant firms' annual changing sales residuals. And you weight this, the weighted sales divided by country GDP, and then your idiosyncratic shock on sales calculated both by country and industry. Did I forget something? No, I think you did.
Perfectly.
Okay. So first of all, I think it's a very well organized paper, made good use of the available space, which can be considered small for the amount of information in your research. You wrote objectively, and this is very good. You wrote clearly also, and you support your arguments in the literature and presented the tables in an informative and static, I would say, static way, including many robustness tests. So congratulations for the presentation of the writing of your paper. You did a very good job on this. Now, I will make some considerations about the contents of your paper. So the first question is, earnings management is a non-observable variable. We do not observe earnings management directly, only indirectly by the models that we develop for this. And dominant firm shock is observable. So you have an observable variable that you are regressing with a non-observed variable. And this is a big problem, I think, that we cannot assure that our findings are effectively based in an economic sense, because we are using some model for measuring earnings management. And maybe this is explain why many of the earnings management papers do not arrive at definitive conclusion. They do not hold for many times a result. The results are inconclusive in general in many earnings management papers. So I think this is a problem. But we have to do something about this, I agree. And the tools that we have are the models for measuring earnings management indirectly. So your research question is the same for positive and negative dominant firm shocks. And maybe I think that the mechanism is different So when we have positive sales shock, as you said, this impact positively the economy and spillovers in many different ways and can benefit the non-dominant firms. And one of these consequences may be reducing earnings management. But I'm not sure if the reverse is true. When sales is negative, when shock is negative, uh, we can expect the same for earnings management increasing because of a negative sales. I think that you should discuss this in a more in a more broad sense, because you focuses only in positive shock. There's only two sentences in your paper and that make the reader perceive that you are also dealing with negative shocks and not only positive shocks. One in methodology and the other one in the motivation. But it's very brief. You discuss all the time the positive shock. And in your sample, you have five countries, 4 or 5 countries. I don't remember for
Yeah,
sure.
nine countries.
9 countries, but 4 or 5 of them have negative shock.
Ah,
When
yeah,
you
yeah,
look at
sure.
descriptive statistics, 4 or 5 of them have negative shock.
Yeah.
So I think you should base your argumentation also in negative shocks, because why negative shocks also produce increase in earnings management. So this is a point that you should care of. Earnings management motivation is linked to management opportunities behavior, which is not to be the case in your research question. So we are told and taught that earnings management happened because of the firm's contractual environment. So information asymmetry between the firm and the contractual parties creates incentive for managers to act opportunistically, using accounting information to bring benefits both for them and the firm. And I think you need to explain how the positive shocks in dominant firms change the contractual environment of non-dominant firms so as to incentivize managers to reduce earnings management. Because if earnings management is derived from the contract that the firm established with the contracting parties, so you are assuming implicitly that when there's a better in the economic environment, uh, these contracts change. I think you can defend this argument, but I didn't see anything about this in your paper. You just said that because of the spillover benefits from the dominant to the non-dominant firms, thinking in an economic view, in an economic sense, the non-dominant firms managers would reduce earnings management. They were not encouraged of engaging in activity of earning management. So I think you think you need to put something about the possibility of changing the contractual environment, maybe. Of course, everything I'm saying is for you to increase the chances of your publishing your paper in a good journal, in a top tier journal. The way the 4 earnings management models were operationalized made them very similar. So you you pose in your presentation this as the similarity between the models in terms of discretionary accruals as a something positive, and I see this as something negative because you use virtually the same model because they are not changing the discretionary accruals. And they are very correlated, and you could change the way of measuring the variables for you get different measures of discretionary accruals, not similar. Because if they are similar, there's no many advantages of using different models of discretionary accruals. They are very similar. So you could change, for example, the way of measuring total accruals. You use just one model, the balance sheet model, that measures working capital accruals, not the non-current accrual. The non-current accrual is not in your measure of total accruals. So you could use other model for measuring total accruals. For example, you could use assigned discretionary accrual, not only the module in the four models. You could use different models for you have an assurance that your results hold, because your results are very in the borderline for significance and non-significance. So I would like to say to see something different in your measure of discretionary accrual for me to have an assurance that your results are linked, are tied to the motivation that you are defending. The same happens with the country and industry level shocks. They are essentially the same. They are 99.97% similar, correlated. So they are equal. You measure by industry and you measure by the country, but it's the same. In a sense, are the same. So because I know that you did very good tests, robustness tests for testing your research question, but I think that you could be more ousado for other proxies that have different dependent and independent variable in terms of the magnitude of the values, for you have a guarantee that your results are good, are linked or are tied to your motivation. So my question is that, as I said in the beginning, the earnings management variable is non-observable. So for it to have an assurance that your results are tied to the motivation questions, so we have to use different way of measuring the dependent and independent variable, not the same. Country and industry level shocks are, as I have already told this. The countries in the sample are quite heterogeneous in terms of dominant firm sales shock. Are France and Poland driving your results? This is a question I don't know. You have 7 points of shock in France and 3 points shock in Poland. And the other countries are also between 0 and 0.5, 0.6, something like this. So are France and Poland driving your results? I think it would be good if you test separately this country. Test France, test Poland, and test the other countries that are similar in terms of the dominant shock measure or variable. So when you mix everything together, you can blur, your result with what is happening in France and in Poland, you know. Because I am not sure about the meaning of the result when you mix 9 countries with different institutional and cultural environment, and you mix everything to get only one answer for all the countries. Why why don't run separate tests for each one of the countries, or the mailing the main countries, for example? Uh, Given the small significance of your result, does the somewhat high pair correlation among leverage, growth, and issue play a role on them? Again, if you run your regression stepwise, look only in the dependent and independent variable as a univariate test. Run a test only with dependent and independent interest variable. And if you find the negative correlation there, then you add all the other variables, because one of the control variables is making the result, you know, you are in the borderline. So it's complicated to assure that the result comes from the motivation that you are defending, you know. So maybe a stepwise regression would be better for us to believe that your results are consistent. So this is my main comment, and I have secondary questions, minor questions. Here is three minor questions. Kothari and et al. Don't propose to include firms ROA in John's model specification. They didn't do this. They separate two groups, one treatment and control group, and you know this. And they, from the treatment group, they took out the average of ROA from the industry, and then they compare with the other group. And they do not include in the specification a ROA. But they do a test like this, including in their paper, they include ROA in their Jones model, just to compare with the treatment and control group separately. And the treatment separate group separately gives a better result than including ROA in the model, Jones model specification. The second minor question is, the balance sheet model measures change in working capital accruals. I have already said this. It doesn't address total accruals. You can see the paper from Hiriba and Collins 2002 and Larson et al. 2018. They show that this model, the balance sheet model, is only a partial measure of total accruals. It's only related to working capital accruals, not total accruals, of course. There's no goodwill, there's no investment in accruals, goodwill, and many other long-term accrual is not present in this model. Discretionary accruals are manageable. It doesn't mean they were managed. Discretionary accruals are manageable, not necessarily managed. This is something that we should think about. So you get almost 10% mean of discretionary accruals, 10% of the assets. So 10% of the assets are manageable, not necessarily managed. And this is the two papers that I refer in this discussion. So thank you. Now I'm gonna open. You want to, we have some time here. No, we have now 15 minutes for the audience. Let's now listen the audience. If you have some question, then if the audience have no question, we can discuss uh, this these points that I I touched here.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much.
So, okay, now we open for the questions. The audience. Jucimar, Elisângela, Cheise Freitas, Romildo, Ilírio, Vanessa. You have some questions, some observations?
Well, maybe while the others are thinking, but you can interrupt me anytime, okay, please. um, I just would like to say thank you one more time because indeed I'm wondering now about some tips or some suggestions that you made. You mentioned it specifically concerning the contractual environment. I think that this could be very interesting to explore. This is this paper that you uh, had the chance to read. It was basically the first draft that we wrote, right? And we are, this is a working paper, of course, and we have been working on this paper, and I guess that to reflect more about the changings in the contractual environment of non-dominant firms could be very interesting, really. um, you also mentioned it about um, how challenge is taking several countries with different backgrounds, different cultural aspects in one single regression. And I totally agree with you. Even though we have many papers on international accounting relying on cross country samples, for sure they will always we will always find some bias in those estimations, even though I am controlling for country fixed effects. But indeed, Poland and France are the most representative countries in our samples, and we could, mm, as you mentioned it, to to do some additional analysis considering those countries individually, maybe. But we have here a challenge because I need to segregate dominant firms from non-dominant firms and estimate discretionary accruals only for non-dominant firms. So when I segregate dominant from non-dominant firms and estimate discretionary accruals for only non-dominant firms, and I need to do clusters only for those non-dominant firms, segregating those non-dominant firms for each year, for each industry, and then it's basically impossible. Do not lost some observations in this process. So we are trying to rely on different earnings management measures to overcome this problem. In the paper, we did some additional analysis considering small positive earnings. That is not a good proxy for earnings management as well, because as Professor Paulo Lustosa mentioned it, um, we will always face some challenging in those earnings management measure because it's a phenomenon that could not be observable, right? But yeah, we are doing our best here. And yes, for sure, I'm going to consider a stepwise regression approach to see that if our results are could change adding regret a variable by variable. But yeah, I just would like to say one more time, thank you so much. Uh, and and yeah, so thank you so much for spending your time with our paper.
What about using, you said it's difficult for you to run uh, all the calculations in the non-dominant firm sample for each one of the countries. What about sorting the country with a damn variable in your regression?
Oh yeah, this is could be interesting as well. Instead of doing clusters, just considering dummy variables, right?
Yeah. For France and Poland, I would like so much to see the result um,
Mhm.
uh, of France and Poland separately. And the other countries, I think there's no problem because they are very similar in terms of the uh, dominant shocks.
Yeah.
Even so, there's, as I said, there's 4 countries that have negative shocks.
Oh
And,
yeah, yeah.
mhm,
This is other very interesting thing that you mentioned it, and I really enjoy it to
mhm.
see if our results remain, maybe considering positive dominant shocks and negative ones. This could be interesting, and I really will consider this approach because it seems that there are completely different incentives, right?
Yeah,
uh,
I think so.
and yeah, I'm very excited to test this. Thank you for this tip.
And you also, it's interesting, you reason this uh, in, in, in joint, conjunctly, with the contractual argumentation. Because if you look at positive accounting theory in 1986, Zimmerman, famous book, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the contractual view of the firm and the contractual theory of the firm. And in basically, the author, Watson Zimmerman, say that um, because of the contracts, accounting information is used for validating the contracts. So there's interest parties and there's asymmetry, information asymmetry. So the parties rely on accounting information for validating the contract. So they accept accounting information and the managers use accounting information to, to, to peacefully make the parts accept what is written in the contracts, the covenants, everything. So the managers choose um, accounting policies according to the contracts that are involving, are presented to their firms. So you bring an argumentation that the economic environment may discourage or encourage uh, managers to to manage earnings. And this is different. I know that there's a literature that supports what we are saying. And you are very clever in using the literature to support your argument. But because this shock with the contractual theory of the firm, I think you should, you benefit your paper will benefit if you bring some discussion about this to support your arguments.
Sure, sure. This is sounds very interesting. Thank you for your suggestion.
Let me see, no question, no question. Autores e mediadores, authors and mediators should present themselves, please. Okay.
We
Okay.
already did, right?
I'm Paulo Lustosa. I'm from University of Brasilia. So, and Dante, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, as I mentioned it, I'm Dante and I'm PhD student at ISCTE, University Institute of Lisbon.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
So we have more 5 minutes. I don't know if there is some question here. No, no
Okay.
question at all. Eu pedi no início da sessão. A menina está dizendo, eu pedi foi no início da sessão, não foi agora, não.
Yeah.
Okay. Então, so if nobody has question to Dante or observation to do, we have more 4 minutes, but we can end the session now because we already discussed his paper. So thank you very much, Dante.
Thank you.
And
thank you. It was very nice to see you again. Hope you have nice days of vacation. And yeah, so maybe you can see in person very soon. I hope so.
okay, so and I wish you success in your career. You are very good um, student. You are now students, but in a short time you're gonna be a PhD professor. I expect
Right.
that you're
Yeah.
gonna share your knowledge in some university in Brazil. And I knew you now reading your paper, and I like very much the way that you write, the way that you synthesize your ideas.
Thank you.
I learned very much with your paper, and for me it was a very good surprise to see your argumentation in the way that you write your paper and all the tests that you did, the way that you present. Very good, very good. And now also in your presentation here, I like very much your English is perfect.
Oh, no worries. Thank you. Thank you. It was a very nice time. Thank you. I really appreciate your time. Really, indeed.
Okay,
Thank you so
bye-bye.
much. Bye bye. Thank you all.